In the winter of 1944, the skies over Europe were filled with the thunder of Allied bombers. The United States Army Air Forces had launched massive daylight raids against German industry, determined to cripple the Reich's ability to wage war. Among the thousands of young men flying these missions was Second Lieutenant Charles Lloyd Smith, a navigator aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress of the 381st Bomb Group. On February 29, 1944, Smith's bomber was returning from a mission over Leverkusen and Solingen, Germany. Anti-aircraft fire and Luftwaffe fighters tore into the formation. His plane was hit, engines failing, and the crew was forced to bail out. Smith parachuted into occupied Belgium near the town of Amay, Hugh. Alone, vulnerable, and deep behind enemy lines, he faced almost certain capture by the Gestapo. But what happened next was extraordinary. Smith was not abandoned. He was taken in by Belgian patriots, members of the underground resistance, and hidden in a network of safe houses. Over the next 6 months, he would be sheltered by thousands of ordinary Belgians, each risking their lives to protect him. This was part of the legendary Comet Line, Réseau Comet, an escape network that smuggled Allied airmen out of occupied Europe. Belgium had been under Nazi occupation since May 1940, when German forces swept through the Low Countries in their blitzkrieg against France. The occupation was brutal. The Gestapo hunted resistance members, deported Jews, and executed suspect collaborators. Yet, despite the danger, Belgian patriots organized underground networks to fight back. One of the most remarkable was the Comet Line, founded in 1941 by André de Jong, a young Belgian woman. The network specialized in rescuing downed Allied pilots, moving them secretly through Belgium and France, and eventually across the Pyrenees into Spain. By the end of the war, the Comet Line had helped more than 800 Allied airmen escape. For Smith, the Comet Line became his lifeline. After landing near Amay, he was quickly taken in by locals, who passed him along the chain of safe houses. He was moved to Liège, then to Brussels, hidden in attics, basements, and back rooms. Each family that sheltered him risked execution if discovered. The scale of support was astonishing. Historians estimate that as many as 20,000 Belgians were involved in sheltering Allied pilots during the war. Some provided food and clothing, others forged documents, and many simply offered a bed for the night. Each act of kindness carried immense risk. The Gestapo was relentless. Informants were everywhere. In May 1944, Smith himself was arrested in Schaerbeek, Brussels, after a betrayal. He was imprisoned in the notorious St. Gilles prison, where countless resistance members were tortured. Yet even in captivity, the network continued to operate, and many pilots were successfully smuggled out. For the Belgian people, helping Allied pilots was more than an act of compassion. It was a statement of defiance. Every rescued Allied airman symbolized hope that liberation was coming. The Allies were bombing German industry, weakening the occupiers, and preparing for invasion. By protecting pilots, Belgians felt they were directly contributing to victory. The risks were immense. Families caught hiding airmen could be executed or sent to concentration camps, yet thousands chose to help anyway. Their courage turned Belgium into one of the most dangerous places for the Gestapo, as underground networks flourished despite constant crackdowns. Smith's survival was not just a personal miracle, it was a testament to the resilience of ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances. His story illustrates how courage, loyalty, and sacrifice combined to defy one of the most ruthless regimes in history.
The American pilot who had parachuted into Belgium quickly discovered that survival depended not on his own training, but on the courage of ordinary people. After landing near Amay, he was guided to a farmhouse where the family risked everything to shelter him. They gave him food, a bed, and whispered instructions on how to remain silent when German patrols passed nearby. The pilot understood that every moment in hiding was a gamble. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, and the penalty for helping an Allied airman was death. Yet the Belgian family did not hesitate. Their decision was an act of defiance against the occupiers, and it marked the beginning of a long journey through the underground world of resistance safehouses. From the countryside, he was moved into Liège, a city under strict German control. Here, the resistance had established a chain of hiding places. He was concealed in attics, basements, and back rooms, each location chosen carefully to avoid suspicion. The pilot was taught basic French phrases to help him blend in, though he was warned never to speak unless necessary. He was disguised as a Belgian worker, given forged identity papers, and instructed to walk with confidence but never to linger. Every trip through the streets was a test of nerves. German soldiers patrolled constantly, and the Gestapo conducted raids without warning. The pilot learned to keep his head down, to avoid eye contact, and to trust the instructions of those guiding him. The Comet Line, the escape network founded by André de Jong, was the lifeline that kept him moving. De Jong, known as Dédé, had built a system that relied on ordinary citizens, teachers, priests, shopkeepers, and farmers, who provided shelter and assistance. By 1944, the network had saved hundreds of Allied airmen, smuggling them through Belgium and France toward Spain. The scale of support was astonishing. Historians estimate that as many as 20,000 Belgians were involved in some way, whether by offering food, forging documents, or simply keeping silent when they knew a pilot was nearby. Each act of kindness carried immense risk, yet the network continued to function despite constant Gestapo crackdowns. Life in hiding was suffocating. The pilot could not leave the safe houses during the day. He had to remain silent when visitors arrived. He could not risk being seen through a window or heard walking across a floor. Even the sound of his breathing seemed dangerous. For months, he lived in shadows, dependent on the courage of strangers. He felt guilt, knowing that his presence endangered the families who sheltered him. He worried constantly about betrayal, aware that one careless word or one suspicious neighbor could bring disaster. Yet he also felt hope. The kindness he experienced convinced him that the Allies had friends everywhere and that liberation was inevitable. The Gestapo's hunt for downed airmen was relentless. They knew that Allied airmen were valuable intelligence assets, and they sought to crush the escape networks that protected them. Raids were frequent, arrests common, and torture routine. Families who sheltered pilots faced execution or deportation to concentration camps. Still, the resistance persisted. Priests forged baptismal certificates to provide false identities. Teachers hid pilots in classrooms. Shopkeepers passed coded messages under the noses of German soldiers. Farmers concealed airmen in barns and fields. Every day was a battle against fear, but the resistance never gave up. In May 1944, betrayal struck. The pilot was arrested in Schaerbeek, Brussels, after being denounced by an informant. He was taken to Sanjols prison, a Gestapo facility notorious for its brutality. Here, countless resistance members had been tortured and executed. For the pilot, captivity was terrifying. He knew that Allied airmen were sometimes spared for interrogation, but he also knew that death was possible. His months of freedom had ended abruptly, yet even in prison he remained part of a larger story of resilience. The Comet Line continued to operate, rescuing other pilots and smuggling them out of Belgium. His capture was a setback, but it did not stop the network. The courage of ordinary citizens is what makes the story remarkable. These were not trained soldiers or spies. They were farmers who offered bread, mothers who hid strangers in their homes, children who kept silent about the men sleeping in their attics. Each act of kindness was an act of defiance. Their courage turned Belgium into one of the most dangerous places for the Gestapo, as underground networks flourished despite constant crackdowns.
The American pilot's ordeal was only one thread in a vast web of resistance activity that stretched across Belgium and into France. By 1944, the Comet Line had become a lifeline for hundreds of Allied airmen who had fallen from the skies during bombing missions. Each man who landed in occupied territory faced the same terrifying choice: surrender to the Germans or trust strangers to hide him. For most, survival depended on the courage of ordinary citizens who risked everything to defy the occupiers. The scale of the Comet Line's operations was astonishing. Historians estimate that more than 800 Allied pilots and soldiers were rescued through its network. Each rescue required dozens, sometimes hundreds of people working together. A single pilot might pass through 20 safe houses, each one staffed by families who provided food, clothing, and shelter. Forgers created false identity papers. Guides escorted pilots through cities and across borders. Farmers concealed them in barns. Priests offered sanctuary in churches, and shopkeepers passed coded messages under the noses of German soldiers. Every act of assistance carried immense risk, yet the network continued to function despite relentless Gestapo crackdowns. The ingenuity of the Belgian resistance was remarkable. Resistance members developed elaborate systems to communicate without detection. Messages were hidden in loaves of bread, sewn into clothing, or passed through whispered conversations in crowded markets. Pilots were disguised as Belgian workers. Their uniforms were placed with civilian clothes. They were taught to walk with confidence, to avoid eye contact, and to speak only when necessary. The smallest mistake could mean disaster, yet the network trained them carefully, preparing them for the perilous journey ahead. The Comet Line's routes were treacherous. Pilots were moved from Belgium into France, often traveling by train or on foot. They were guided through forests, across rivers, and into safe houses in Paris. From there, they were escorted south toward the Pyrenees, the rugged mountains that separated France from Spain. Crossing the Pyrenees was the most dangerous part of the journey. Pilots had to hike for days through snow and ice, often without proper equipment. German patrols hunted them, and the risk of capture was constant. Yet the Comet Line persisted, guiding hundreds of men to safety. The sacrifices made by the resistance were immense. Many members of the Comet Line were arrested, tortured, and executed. André de Jong herself was captured in 1943 and imprisoned in Ravensbrück concentration camp. She survived, but many of her comrades did not. The Gestapo infiltrated the network, using informants to betray safe houses. Families who sheltered pilots were often executed or deported. Yet, despite these losses, the Comet Line continued to operate, driven by the determination of ordinary people who refused to surrender. For the American pilot hidden in Belgium, the scale of support was overwhelming. He realized that his survival depended not on luck, but on the courage of thousands of strangers. Each family that sheltered him risked their lives. Each forged document, each whispered instruction, each meal shared in secret was an act of defiance against tyranny. The pilot understood that he was part of something larger than himself, a movement of resistance that spanned nations and united people in the fight for freedom. The psychological toll on the resistance was severe. Families lived in constant fear of raids, arrests, and executions. Children were taught to remain silent, to never speak of the strangers in their homes. Priests risked their lives to provide false documents. Teachers hid pilots in classrooms. Shopkeepers passed messages under the noses of German soldiers. Every day was a battle against fear, but the resistance never gave up. Their determination inspired the pilots they sheltered, giving them hope that liberation was near. The Comet Line's success was not only measured in the number of pilots rescued, but also in the morale it provided. Each airman who returned to Britain carried with him a story of courage and defiance. These stories boosted Allied morale, reminding soldiers and civilians alike that the people of occupied Europe were fighting back. The pilots who survived often returned to combat, flying new missions over Germany. Their survival meant that the Allies could continue their bombing campaigns, weakening the Reich's industrial base and hastening its defeat. The network also demonstrated the power of ordinary citizens to resist tyranny. The Belgian people were not soldiers, yet they played a crucial role in the war. Their courage and determination proved that resistance was possible, even under the most brutal occupation. Their actions inspired others across Europe, contributing to a broader movement of defiance that undermined German control. For the pilot, the months in hiding were a test of endurance. He lived in constant fear of discovery, aware that his presence endangered the families that sheltered him. He struggled with guilt, knowing that his survival came at great risk to others. Yet he also felt gratitude, overwhelmed by the kindness he experienced. The courage of the Belgian people convinced him that the Allies would prevail. He realized that victory was not only a matter of military strength, but also of human determination. The story of the Comet Line is a reminder that war is not only fought on battlefields. It is fought in homes, in churches, in classrooms, and in shops. It is fought by ordinary people who choose to resist, who choose to act, who choose to risk everything for freedom. The Belgian resistance demonstrated that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion can prevail. Their actions saved hundreds of lives, contributed to the Allied victory, and left a legacy of defiance that continues to inspire. The months of captivity in St. Gilles prison weighed heavily on the American pilot. He had already endured the suffocating tension of hiding in Belgian homes, the constant fear of discovery, and the guilt of endangering those who sheltered him. Now he faced the grim reality of Gestapo interrogation. The prison was notorious for its brutality. Resistance members were tortured, beaten, and executed. The pilot knew that his fate was uncertain. He was valuable as a source of intelligence, but he was also expendable. Every day he listened to the footsteps of guards in the corridors, wondering if they would stop at his cell. Inside the prison, he met Belgian resistance members who had been captured. Their courage inspired him. Even under torture, many refused to betray their comrades. They whispered encouragement to one another, passing scraps of information through the cracks in the walls. The pilot realized that he was part of a larger struggle, one that extended far beyond his own survival. The resistance fighters around him had sacrificed everything for freedom. Their determination gave him strength. As the months passed, news of the Allied advance filtered into the prison. Guards spoke of battles in Normandy, of the bombing of German cities, of the growing strength of the Allied armies. The pilot understood that liberation was coming. He clung to hope, even as the Gestapo tightened its grip. In August 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into France, the Germans began evacuating prisoners from Belgium. The pilot was moved, along with hundreds of others, toward Germany. The journey was brutal. Prisoners were crammed into trains, given little food or water, and subjected to constant abuse. Yet even in these conditions, the spirit of resistance endured. Men shared scraps of bread, whispered prayers, and reminded one another that the war was turning. The pilot's ordeal highlighted the contrast between German oppression and American abundance. He had seen the prosperity of the United States before the war, and he had glimpsed it again during his time in captivity. Letters from home described families living in safety, factories producing at full capacity, and soldiers well supplied. In Germany, by contrast, civilians faced shortages, bombings, and despair. The pilot realized that industrial power was the decisive factor in the war. When the Allies liberated Belgium in September 1944, the pilot was freed. He emerged from captivity exhausted but alive. The sight of American tanks rolling through the streets of Brussels filled him with pride. He saw civilians cheering, waving flags, and embracing soldiers. For the Belgians, liberation was the culmination of years of suffering. For the pilot, it was proof that the sacrifices of the resistance had not been in vain. The months that he had spent in hiding and captivity left a lasting impression. He understood that his survival had depended on the courage of thousands of strangers. Farmers who offered bread, mothers who hid him in their homes, children who kept silent, priests who forged documents, all had risked their lives for him. He realized that the war was not only fought on battlefields, but also in kitchens, attics, and classrooms. The resistance had played a crucial role in the Allied victory, and he owed his life to their determination. The shock of America's industrial might became clear when he returned home. He saw factories producing cars, trucks, and planes in staggering numbers. He saw farms yielding abundant harvests, feeding millions without shortages. He saw railroads carrying goods across vast distances, ensuring that every soldier was supplied. The contrast with Europe was overwhelming. In Germany, cities lay in ruins, factories destroyed, and civilians starving. In America, prosperity continued, even in wartime. The pilot realized that this industrial power had been the decisive factor in the war. Historians later confirmed what he had witnessed. The United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, compared to Germany's 100,000. It built 2,710 Liberty ships, ensuring that supplies flowed steadily to Allied forces. It manufactured 2.4 million trucks, compared to Germany's 345,000. These numbers told the story of victory. America's industrial base was unmatched, and it ensured that the Allies could fight on multiple fronts. The pilot's experience in Belgium illustrated the human dimension of this industrial power. He had been fed generously even as a prisoner, a sign of America's abundance. He had seen guards equipped with sturdy boots, clean uniforms, and reliable weapons, evidence of a nation that could supply even its prison staff. He had realized that the humane treatment he received was possible because of prosperity. In Germany, shortages often led to cruelty. In America, abundance allowed compassion. The legacy of his survival extended beyond his own life. He shared his story with fellow soldiers, with civilians, and with historians. He emphasized the courage of the Belgian resistance, the sacrifices of ordinary people, and the decisive role of American industry. His testimony became part of the broader narrative of the war, a reminder that victory was achieved not only through battles, but also through the determination of civilians and the power of factories. When the war ended in May 1945, the American pilot, who had been hidden by thousands of Belgians, returned home with memories that would never fade. His survival had depended on the courage of ordinary people who risked everything to protect him. Farmers, priests, teachers, shopkeepers, and children had all played a role in keeping him alive. Their sacrifices were not forgotten. The pilot understood that his story was part of a larger narrative of resistance, defiance, and survival. The legacy of these experiences extended far beyond the war itself. For the Belgians, the act of sheltering Allied pilots was a symbol of defiance against tyranny. It demonstrated that even under brutal occupation, ordinary citizens could resist. Their courage inspired others across Europe, contributing to a broader movement of resistance that undermined German control. For the pilots who survived, the kindness they experienced left a lasting impression. Many returned to Belgium after the war to thank the families who had sheltered them. Some formed lifelong friendships, maintaining contact for decades. The pilot's reflections highlight the interconnectedness of war. He lived for months in hiding, dependent on the courage of strangers. He struggled with guilt, knowing that his presence endangered the families who sheltered him. He endured captivity, facing the brutality of the Gestapo. Yet he also experienced kindness, compassion, and hope. These experiences shaped his understanding of humanity. He realized that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could prevail. The legacy of his survival influenced post-war relations between America and Belgium. The stories of pilots hidden by the resistance became symbols of friendship between the two nations. They demonstrated the shared commitment to freedom and democracy. They reminded people that victory had been achieved not only through military strength, but also through human determination. The Belgian people, the memory of sheltering pilots became part of their national identity. It was a source of pride, a reminder of their courage during the occupation. Families who had risked their lives were honored, their sacrifices recognized. The Comet Line became a symbol of resistance, celebrated in history books and memorials. The story of the pilot hidden by 20,000 Belgians was retold for generations, inspiring new audiences with its message of courage and defiance. The pilot himself became a witness to history. He shared his story with fellow soldiers, with civilians, and with historians. He emphasized the courage of the Belgian resistance, the sacrifices of ordinary people, and the decisive role of American industry. His testimony became part of the broader narrative of the war, a reminder that victory was achieved not only through battles, but also through the determination of civilians and the power of factories. The shock of America's industrial might remained a central theme in his reflections. He had seen the prosperity of the United States before the war, and he had glimpsed it again during his time in captivity. He understood that industrial power was the decisive factor in the conflict. America's factories, farms, and railroads ensured that its armies were fed, clothed, and armed. Germany could not match this scale. The pilot realized that victory was inevitable, not because of ideology or propaganda, but because of industrial disparity. The story of the pilot hidden by 20,000 Belgians is a testament to the power of human compassion and industrial strength. It shows that even in the darkest times, courage and determination can prevail. It reminds us that war is not only about destruction, but also about survival, hope, and the resilience of ordinary people. The pilot's survival was a miracle, but it was also the result of countless acts of kindness and the overwhelming power of American industry. As he looked back on his ordeal, the pilot understood that his story was part of a larger narrative. He was one of hundreds who owed their lives to the Comet Line. He was one of thousands who experienced the shock of America's industrial might. His survival was a symbol of the interconnectedness of war, a reminder that victory depended on both human courage and industrial power. His story continues to inspire, reminding us that even in the darkest times, hope can endure and freedom can prevail. The legacy of the Belgian resistance is not only historical, but also moral. It demonstrates that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices. It shows that courage is not limited to soldiers on battlefields, but extends to families in kitchens, priests in churches, and children in classrooms. It reminds us that resistance is possible, even under the most brutal occupation. The Belgian people proved that tyranny could be defied, that freedom could be preserved, and that humanity could endure. The pilot's survival is a symbol of this legacy. His story illustrates the power of compassion, the importance of courage, and the decisive role of industrial strength. It is a reminder that victory in war depends not only on weapons and armies, but also on the determination of ordinary people and the testimony of industry. It is a story that continues to resonate decades after the guns fell silent.